Welcome to the Undercover Insights channel. Today, I'm going to tell you about the story, two cops thought they caught an easy target, but they had no idea he was the new police chief. Wrongfully arrested, Chief Tyrone Maxwell flips the script, exposing corruption and demanding justice. What happens next will shock you. Stay tuned to see how one man ignited a movement for accountability. The night was deceptively calm in the heart of Birmingham, Alabama. Tyrone Maxwell, a 50-year-old former civil rights attorney turned chief of police, was on his way home after a long day spent working with community leaders. Driving through the quiet streets in his modest black sedan, his mind wandered to the pot roast his wife had promised for dinner, a comfort after a day full of tense meetings. He turned onto Maplewood Drive, his thoughts momentarily distracted by the glow of the streetlights. Suddenly, the tranquility of the evening shattered. Red and blue lights flared in his rearview mirror, cutting through the darkness like a blade. The sharp wail of a siren followed, its sound piercing and insistent. Tyrone's grip tightened on the steering wheel as a sense of dread crept in. He instinctively glanced at his speedometer, 30 miles per hour in a 35 zone. No violations, no reason to stop him. His car was in perfect condition, yet here he was, pulled over on an empty road with two patrol cars behind him. "Stay calm," he muttered under his breath, signaling and pulling over. He'd been in this situation before, too many times. He knew the rules: hands on the wheel, movements slow, words polite. It wasn't just instinct, it was survival. The driver's side door of the lead patrol car opened. A tall officer with a square jaw and a flashlight approached Tyrone's window, his steps brisk and aggressive. Behind him, a stockier officer lingered near the rear bumper of Tyrone's car, his hand resting casually on his holstered gun. The tension in the air was palpable. "You in a hurry tonight?" the first officer barked, his tone sharp and accusatory. The flashlight beam cut into Tyrone's face, forcing him to squint. "No, sir," Tyrone replied evenly, his voice calm but firm. "Just heading home." The officer didn't respond right away. His flashlight moved slowly over Tyrone's lap, the console, and the passenger seat before returning to his face. "License and registration," he finally demanded, his tone unyielding. Tyrone nodded, narrating his every move as he reached into the glove compartment. "I'm retrieving my registration now. My license is in my wallet. I'll grab it next." The officer said nothing, but his posture remained rigid, the air between them crackling with suspicion. "Do you know why I stopped you?" the officer asked, though the question felt more like a trap than an inquiry. "No, sir," Tyrone replied honestly. "I was driving within the speed limit and—" "You were swerving," the officer interrupted, his voice curt and dismissive. "Into the other lane, reckless driving." "With respect, sir, I wasn't swerving," Tyrone said, maintaining his calm. "I have a dashcam. It'll confirm I was driving normally." "Dashcam, huh?" The officer's eyes narrowed as his lips curled into a sneer. "That'll be confiscated for evidence. Step out of the car." Tyrone blinked, taken aback by the sudden escalation. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I'm fully cooperating." "I said step out of the car," the officer repeated, his voice louder now, more menacing. Tyrone exhaled slowly and unbuckled his seatbelt, moving deliberately. He opened the door, his hands raised in clear view. As soon as he stepped out, the second officer swooped in, grabbing his arm and yanking him toward the patrol car. "Is this really necessary?" Tyrone asked, his voice measured despite the indignity of the moment. "Resisting, huh?" the first officer sneered. "You want to play that game? Fine by me." The cold bite of the handcuffs against his wrists was a stark reminder of the power imbalance. Tyrone's mind raced as they shoved him into the back seat of the patrol car. He glanced down the street, catching a glimpse of neighbors peeking through their blinds, their silhouettes illuminated by dim porch lights. No one stepped outside. No one said a word. The officers had no idea who they had just arrested, but Tyrone wasn't planning to stay silent for long. Inside the patrol car, the younger officer, Harris, glanced at Tyrone through the rearview mirror, his smirk evident even in the dim light. "So, what's your story? Late-night drug run? Or just looking for trouble?" Tyrone locked eyes with Harris, his gaze steady and unflinching. "I'm just a man trying to get home." "Yeah, sure," the other officer, Brooks, chimed in with a snort. "Reckless drivers always have a story." Tyrone bit his tongue, knowing that any argument would only escalate the situation. Instead, he took a deep breath, mentally preparing for what lay ahead. He knew his rights, but he also knew the system, and how often it failed people like him. When they reached the precinct, the harsh fluorescent lights illuminated every corner of the holding area. Harris removed Tyrone's handcuffs with exaggerated flair, his smirk never wavering. "Welcome to our humble abode," Harris mocked. "You're gonna be here for a while." "Am I being charged?" Tyrone asked, rubbing his wrists as the cold metal was removed. "We'll let you know once we figure that out," Brooks replied casually, leaning against the desk. Tyrone was led to a small holding cell and shoved inside. The metal door clanged shut, the sound echoing through the empty corridor. He sat on the bench, his hands clasped and his posture steady. Outside the cell, Harris and Brooks chuckled, their voices low but audible. "Nothing in his car, nothing on him. What's the point?" Harris muttered. "Guys like him always have skeletons," Brooks replied with a smug grin. "We'll dig something up." Tyrone remained silent, listening to their exchange with an expression of quiet calculation. This wasn't about reckless driving or resisting arrest. It was about intimidation, plain and simple. But what the officers didn't realize was that their actions had just set a much larger chain of events into motion. As the hours dragged on, Tyrone's thoughts shifted from indignation to resolve. He thought of the work he had done to fight against abuses of power, the people who had put their trust in him to lead, and the changes he had vowed to make. This wasn't just a personal affront, it was an attack on everything he stood for. Then, just as dawn broke, the sound of sharp heels echoed down the corridor. A tall woman in a crisp uniform appeared, her badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Her gaze flicked to Tyrone, then to the two officers lounging at the desk. "What's going on here?" she demanded. Harris straightened, his confidence faltering. "Reckless driving and resisting arrest." Her eyes narrowed. "Did you review his dashcam footage?" The officers exchanged a glance, suddenly less sure of themselves. Not yet." "Do it now," she snapped, her tone leaving no room for argument. As the officers scrambled to comply, Tyrone leaned back against the cold wall of the cell, a faint smile playing on his lips. He knew the tide was about to turn. This wasn't just another arrest. This was the beginning of their reckoning. The cold metal bench pressed against Tyrone Maxwell's back as he sat in the holding cell, his hands clasped and his posture steady. Though he appeared calm, his mind was a storm of calculated thoughts, replaying every moment of the night's events. Every sharp word, every unnecessary escalation was a vivid reminder of the systemic issues he had spent his entire career fighting to dismantle. The irony of his position wasn't lost on him. He had become a victim of the very injustice he had vowed to reform. Outside the cell, officers Harris and Brooks leaned casually against a desk, their smug laughter drifting into the quiet hallway. They sifted through Tyrone's license and registration, clearly expecting to find some incriminating detail. "Nothing out of the ordinary," Harris muttered, sounding almost disappointed. "Doesn't matter," Brooks replied with a smirk. "Guys like him always have skeletons in the closet. We'll find something." Tyrone heard every word, his expression remaining unreadable. He wasn't angry, he was calculating. Patience was his ally, and he knew it would pay off. He had spent years navigating power structures and injustice, and tonight was no different. He remained still, waiting for the scales to tip in his favor. The hours dragged on, the fluorescent lights casting a relentless glare over the precinct. Other officers came and went, some casting curious glances at the man in the cell. None seemed to recognize him, but Tyrone had expected that. He was new to Birmingham, having taken over as chief of police only 3 weeks prior. His low profile had been intentional, but now it played into the officer's hands, at least for the moment. Just as the first light of dawn crept into the sky, echoing footsteps signaled the arrival of a higher-ranking officer. Lieutenant Naomi Carter strode into view, her presence immediately commanding respect. Her crisp uniform bore an air of authority, and her sharp gaze flicked between Tyrone and the two officers. She exuded professionalism, a stark contrast to Harris and Brooks. "What's going on here?" Carter's voice cut through the precinct like a knife, her tone sharp and unyielding. Harris stepped forward, attempting to mask his unease. "Picked him up last night for reckless driving and resisting arrest." Carter raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Reckless driving? Where's the evidence?" "We haven't processed it yet," Brooks replied lazily, leaning against the desk with feigned indifference. Carter's eyes narrowed as she turned her attention to Tyrone. "Sir, do you have any idea why you were stopped?" Tyrone stood, meeting her gaze with calm composure. "I was told it was for reckless driving, which I categorically deny. I also have a dashcam that can verify my version of events." Her jaw tightened, the weight of her professionalism clashing with the clear misconduct in front of her. She spun toward Harris and Brooks, her tone icy. "You didn't review his dashcam footage?" Brooks shrugged nonchalantly. "We didn't get to it yet." Carter exhaled sharply, her displeasure evident. "Get it now. Harris, Brooks. My office. Now." The two officers exchanged uneasy glances before slinking away, their earlier arrogance visibly deflated. Tyrone watched them go, a faint glimmer of satisfaction flickering in his eyes. The tide was turning, but this was only the beginning. The precinct buzzed with activity as Tyrone waited for Carter to return. Every so often an officer would glance in his direction, their expressions curious but guarded. Meanwhile, Tyrone remained seated, his mind steady as a metronome. His resolve only strengthened with each passing moment. When Carter returned, she was holding a tablet, her expression grave. She approached the cell, gesturing for Tyrone to step closer. "We've reviewed your dashcam footage," she said, her tone clipped but professional. "I've also spoken with the arresting officers. Let me be clear, this should never have happened. The footage contradicts their report entirely." Tyrone raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "I'm releasing you immediately," she added, unlocking the cell door. "But I'd like to discuss next steps privately." Moments later, Tyrone was seated across from Carter in her stark, no-frills office. The desk between them was bare, save for a notepad and a coffee mug. Carter folded her hands, her expression a mix of frustration and curiosity. "I'll be filing a report against Harris and Brooks," she began, her voice steady. "But there's something I need to ask." She hesitated, clearly weighing her words. "Who are you? You're far too composed for someone who just spent the night in a holding cell over nothing." Tyrone leaned back slightly, a small, measured smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I appreciate your diligence, Lieutenant. Let's just say I've been in situations like this before. I've learned to stay calm." Carter studied him for a moment, her sharp eyes narrowing as if trying to piece together a puzzle. Finally, she nodded. "Fair enough, but I have a feeling this isn't the last we'll hear of this situation." As Tyrone stepped out of the precinct, the early morning sun cast a golden glow over the city. The events of the night weighed heavily on his shoulders, but his steps were deliberate. He didn't head home. Instead, he drove straight to the police headquarters he now oversaw. His assistant, Anita, looked up from her desk, startled to see him so early. "Chief Maxwell, you're here already?" Tyrone gave her a nod, his expression neutral, but resolute. "It's been a long night, Anita. Could you prepare the briefing room? I need to address the department this afternoon." Anita nodded quickly, sensing the gravity in his tone. As Tyrone stepped into his office and closed the door behind him, he exhaled deeply. The weight of what had transpired pressed against him, but it also fueled his determination. This wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about what his experience represented: the broken system, the unchecked power, and the urgent need for accountability. The night's ordeal wasn't an ending. It was the spark that would ignite a movement. Tyrone knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. Change was coming, and it would start with him. Tyrone Maxwell leaned back in the defendant's chair, his demeanor calm and composed, but his mind sharp and alert. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Word of the case had spread like wildfire, drawing reporters and spectators alike. Though cameras weren't allowed inside, the courthouse steps swarmed with media, ready to dissect every detail once the hearing concluded. Tyrone sat quietly while his attorney, Sandra Price, sifted through a thick binder of evidence. Her sharp gaze and air of quiet confidence filled the room, making it clear she was prepared for battle. Across the aisle, Officers Harris and Brooks sat with their department-appointed lawyer. Harris's knee bounced nervously, betraying his unease, while Brooks leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, attempting to exude smug indifference. Tyrone's expression remained unreadable as he watched the two officers. This wasn't just about him. It was about the systemic issues they represented. The door opened, and the judge entered, a no-nonsense man with a stern face and an aura that demanded order. The room fell silent as he called the session to order. "We are here today to address the charges brought against Mr. Tyrone Maxwell. Prosecution, you may proceed." The prosecutor, a young and visibly nervous lawyer, rose and began outlining the case. On the night in question, the defendant was observed driving recklessly, swerving into another lane. Upon being stopped by Officers Harris and Brooks, he became uncooperative and resisted arrest. Sandra leaned over to Tyrone, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're walking straight into the trap." When it was Sandra's turn, she stood with quiet authority. Her voice was steady and commanding. "Your Honor, the charges against my client are not only baseless, but are a direct result of racial profiling and abuse of power. To prove this, I will present irrefutable video evidence that contradicts the officer's statements." The judge nodded, motioning for her to proceed. Sandra gestured to the bailiff, who dimmed the lights as the first video began playing on the large screen. The courtroom watched in tense silence as the dashcam footage rolled. Tyrone's car cruised steadily down the road, his speedometer holding at a consistent 29 miles per hour. The patrol car behind him activated its lights without cause. Gasps rippled through the audience as the footage continued, showing Tyrone calmly pulling over and narrating his every movement. Sandra paused the video. "This footage clearly shows that my client was not driving recklessly, as the prosecution claims. Now, let's move to the body cam footage." The next video began, and the room collectively held its breath. The footage showed Officers Harris and Brooks approaching Tyrone's car. Harris muttered under his breath, "Another one of them causing trouble." Brooks responded with a low chuckle. "Figures." The officer's aggressive tone was evident from the start. The audience shifted uncomfortably as the footage continued. It captured Tyrone calmly complying with every request, narrating his actions to avoid escalation. Despite his composed demeanor, the officers grew increasingly hostile. The video ended with the unnecessary handcuffing and detention of Tyrone. Sandra turned to the jury, her voice cutting through the tension. This is not just an abuse of power. It is a direct violation of my client's rights, rooted in bias and prejudice. The prosecutor fumbled, visibly flustered. The officers believed they had probable cause. Sandra cut him off sharply. Probable cause based on what? Driving safely? Following instructions? Or was it perhaps the color of his skin? Her words reverberated through the courtroom. The judge banged his gavel lightly, calling for order. Ms. Price, keep this focused. Sandra nodded, but remained resolute. Your Honor, before we proceed, my client has something he would like to share with the court. Tyrone stood, adjusting his tie as he scanned the room. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of his resolve. My name is Tyrone Maxwell. I am the chief of police for this city, appointed 3 weeks ago to lead this department and address the very issues you've seen here today. I chose not to disclose my position initially because I wanted the truth to come out organically, without bias or interference. And now it has. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Harris's face turned ghostly pale, and Brooks's smug expression melted into shock. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding silence. Tyrone continued, his voice unwavering. This isn't just about me. It's about a system that allows officers like Harris and Brooks to operate without accountability. That ends now. The room buzzed with tension as Tyrone returned to his seat. His final words hung in the air like a thunderclap, their impact undeniable. Harris and Brooks sat frozen, their faces a mixture of fear and disbelief. For the first time, the gravity of their actions was sinking in. The judge called for a brief recess, giving everyone a moment to absorb what had just transpired. Tyrone sat quietly, his composure unshaken, while Sandra leaned over. You just dropped a bombshell. They won't recover from this. When the session resumed, the prosecutor offered no further arguments. The judge dismissed the charges against Tyrone immediately, his tone heavy with disapproval as he addressed the officers. This court will not tolerate abuse of power or the targeting of individuals based on prejudice. This matter will be referred for further investigation. As Tyrone stepped out of the courthouse, the early afternoon sun warmed his face. Reporters swarmed him, microphones and cameras thrust forward. Chief Maxwell, do you have a statement? Tyrone raised a hand, signaling for silence. The crowd stilled, eager for his response. This case isn't just about me, he began, his voice steady and resolute. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that every person, regardless of who they are, is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. As chief of police, I am committed to creating a department that values integrity and fairness. And as a citizen, I will continue to fight for justice. The reporters pressed for more, but Tyrone didn't linger. There was more work to be done. This moment was not just a victory, it was a reckoning, one that would ripple far beyond the courtroom. As Tyrone Maxwell stepped out of the courthouse, the blinding flashes of cameras and the cacophony of shouted questions surrounded him. Reporters jostled for position, their microphones thrust forward in a chaotic frenzy. Chief Maxwell, do you have a statement? One called out, desperation and curiosity evident in their tone. Tyrone raised a steady hand, commanding immediate silence. The crowd stilled, anticipation heavy in the air. His voice, calm but unwavering, cut through the noise. This case isn't just about me, he began, his words deliberate and powerful. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that every person, regardless of who they are, is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. As chief of police, I am committed to building a department rooted in integrity and fairness, and as a citizen, I will continue to fight for justice. The gravity of his words hung in the air, resonating with everyone in earshot. The reporters continued to press for more, their cameras rolling, but Tyrone didn't linger. He turned and walked toward his car, his focus already shifting to the monumental task ahead. The fallout from the courtroom revelation was immediate and seismic. Officers Harris and Brooks were swiftly suspended, pending a formal investigation. As the dashcam and bodycam footage hit the airwaves, public outrage exploded. Protesters gathered outside City Hall and the police precinct, their chants demanding accountability echoing through the streets. Signs emblazoned with phrases like "Justice for All" and "End Police Corruption" became a common sight. Community leaders rallied together, their voices unified in demanding transparency and reform. Town halls filled to capacity as residents shared stories of their own encounters with law enforcement. The city was buzzing with energy, anger, hope, and a collective determination to bring about change. Tyrone wasted no time. He called an emergency meeting at the precinct, summoning every officer under his command. The room was packed, the atmosphere tense as Tyrone stood at the front, his presence commanding. He scanned the room, his gaze steady but piercing. "What happened to me last night," he began, his voice sharp and resolute, "was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem, a culture that has been allowed to fester for far too long. Let me make this clear. As long as I am chief, I will not tolerate harassment, intimidation, or abuse of power. We are here to serve and protect, not to instill fear or perpetuate injustice. If you can't uphold those values, this is not the place for you." The room was silent, his words cutting through any lingering resistance like a blade. The officers shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in agreement, while others avoided his gaze entirely. Tyrone's tone softened slightly, but his resolve remained unshaken. "I know change isn't easy, but it is necessary, and it starts today." In the weeks that followed, Tyrone rolled out sweeping reforms. Mandatory bias training became a cornerstone of the department's new policies, alongside stricter oversight measures and an anonymous reporting system for officer misconduct. Tyrone worked closely with community leaders to ensure their voices were heard, establishing a citizens' oversight committee with real authority to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary actions. The changes didn't come without resistance. Some officers bristled at the new policies, complaining that they were being unfairly scrutinized. A handful even resigned, claiming the department was bowing to public pressure. Tyrone remained unfazed. "If accountability feels like an attack," he told the press during a briefing, "then you were never suited for this job in the first place." Slowly, the community began to see a shift. Officers who embraced the reforms found themselves earning newfound respect from residents, while the Oversight Committee gained traction as a powerful symbol of transparency. Trust, though fragile, was beginning to rebuild. Months later, Tyrone sat on a panel at a packed town hall meeting. The room buzzed with energy as residents shared their stories and concerns. A young man, barely out of his teens, stood up to speak, his voice cracking with emotion. "Chief Maxwell," he began, "what you went through, it could have been me. It could have been any of us. Thank you for standing up, not just for yourself, but for all of us." Tyrone nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of the young man's words. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he replied, his voice steady but laced with conviction. "But together we can build a system that truly serves everyone." The room erupted in applause, the sound reverberating with a sense of shared hope. As the meeting concluded, Tyrone lingered for a moment, watching as people filed out with renewed determination in their eyes. He knew the fight was far from over. The system was deeply entrenched, and there would always be those who resisted change. But for the first time in a long time, he felt the tide turning. Back at his office, Tyrone outlined his next steps. The reforms needed to be expanded, ingrained into the department's very foundation. He envisioned partnerships with local organizations to provide resources for underserved communities and programs to foster positive interactions between officers and residents. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Tyrone walked through the city streets, now alive with a renewed sense of possibility. Children played in newly refurbished parks, families gathered at community events, and neighbors exchanged greetings with warmth. He found himself standing at the corner where his ordeal had begun, the streetlights casting a soft glow over the pavement. Tyrone's gaze fell on the quiet suburban homes around him. This city, his city, was changing, not because of him alone, but because of the collective efforts of a community that refused to accept the status quo. He felt a surge of pride and resolve. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he was ready. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. "Town hall feedback is overwhelmingly positive. The community is behind you. Let's keep the momentum going." Tyrone smiled faintly, his steps firm and purposeful as he walked toward the precinct. The fight for justice was far from over, but he was ready for whatever came next. Together, they were building a future where accountability wasn't just an aspiration, it was a reality. The story of Tyrone Maxwell teaches us the importance of resilience, integrity, and courage in the face of systemic injustice. It reminds us that silence allows corruption to thrive, but standing up for truth can spark meaningful change. In today's world, we must demand accountability from those in power and work collectively to dismantle systems of discrimination. Whether through advocacy, allyship, or amplifying marginalized voices, every action counts. This story encourages us to approach injustice not with despair, but with determination, proving that one voice backed by courage and community can ignite a movement toward a fairer society. Subscribe Undercover Insights channel for more meaningful and inspiring stories.